We have very important things to talk about. We have notes.
All right, so this video came into existence because we get so many questions in the comment section about just the basics of brewing. And so we were like, okay, we know what we're doing, but maybe we're not conveying that information specifically enough to our viewers. So.
And we have over 400 videos on our channel, so that information is well dispersed all over the place. I can't expect that everybody sits and watches 400 plus videos of us in a row. And if you do, thank you so much. And wow, I'm so sorry. But yes, so those things are dispersed all over the place. So you can't get it all in one place. So we thought, let's just go through. This is kind of like a brewing 101. It's the procedures and processes of brewing, like the steps, sort of, kind of. So that's what it is. So what is step number one?
Step number one is recipe creation.
She got that from the list.
And I got that from the list. That's why I glanced down and then glanced back up. Because, stuff. But basically, you want to have an understanding of where you're going. You don't want to just start throwing stuff into a bottle and hope that it works, because...
Though that does actually work on occasion, more often than you might think. I don't recommend it, but it does actually work.
But there's some basic things that you want to have thought about ahead of time that's going to really help you find the right things to throw in that bottle.
Right. When it comes to recipe creation, essentially the idea is, what would you like your finished product to be? And it can be somewhat general. Like you can say, oh, I know I want it to be a mid-high level ABV. I want it to be sweet. I want something fruity. I want a mead or a wine. All those things are factors. You can make the same brew 20 times and it might come out a little bit different each time. Now, that's even using specific ingredients because your environment's just a little bit different. We are not commercial brewers, so, slight variances can make huge differences. If you use a different yeast, it's going to taste different. If you use a different fruit, it's going to taste different. If you use a different honey, it's going to taste different. I think you get the idea.
But if you have the basics, like I want a high ABV, then then there's these specific yeasts that I need to choose in order to achieve that high ABV. If you want a low ABV, basically I can use whatever yeast I want to, but
within reason.
But if I use these particular yeasts, then I might get a better product in the end.
Right.
If you want it to be sweet, then you're either going to let it ferment out to completion to be dry and then back sweeten, or you're going to play with the math and try to over sweeten it slightly up front so that you end up with a sweet beverage, etc., so forth and so on.
Yeah, we're not getting into each individual thing today, but just know that, like for back sweetening, like she said, if you want something to end up sweet, you can back sweeten, which means basically you're going to end up having to stabilize in some way, and then you add sweetener to an already dry beverage, or you need to overpower that yeast, or you can step feed, which is technically overpowering the yeast, but in a slightly different manner. So there's multiple ways to achieve the same result. You just want to know, this is how I'd like to get to that point. Each one has its advantages and disadvantages. That is something I'm going to say, go find a video that we talk about that and watch that, because we can go into greater detail. Once you have your recipe, though, what's the next step?
Number 2 is primary fermentation. So you know what you're going to do, so now it's time to put that stuff in the bottle, right? Primary fermentation is just that. It's the primary fermentation.
It's when the majority of fermentation takes place. In our case, it's when probably almost all the fermentation takes place, because we don't actually like to move from primary to the next phase until we see that fermentation is completed. Now, completed is kind of an odd name because it might not actually be done, but it's not going to ferment any further in the condition that it's in, if that makes sense.
So a subset of number 2 is number 3, which is a gravity reading. And we can't stress how important it is to take a gravity reading. Brian, why is it important?
Because 9 out of 10 questions that we get on our channel are, I made this thing and I didn't have a hydrometer because I was impatient and I just made it anyway. And now I want to know what my gravity reading is from the beginning, but I don't have one because I didn't have a hydrometer because I was impatient and made this thing before I had a hydrometer. No, really. The real reason is because having a hydrometer reading in the very beginning tells you where you're at. Like if you start out, if you take a gravity reading and it's off the chart, you know you done messed up. I mean, you know something has to be adjusted or it's just probably not going to work. We have a rough idea of what we like our gravity to be, and within like 10, 20, even 30 points, you're probably just fine. People will, on occasion, like if we say, oh, ours was 1.106 and they got 1.102, sometimes people will freak out thinking, oh, it's so different. No, 4 points, don't even worry about it, because that could just be a few drops of water in your vessel. It's really not a big deal.
The points thing always freaks me out because to me, in my mind, a full point would be on the...
Like 1 point something to 2 point something. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, specific gravity is a little bit weird. And somebody actually said I use fuzzy math. Let me explain. If you add the points up, like say I'm using 2 pounds of honey. Let's just go with that because honey is 0.035 specific gravity per pound in a gallon of must, right? Or 35 points. That's how it's set. So it's really thousandths of a point, but people say points.
Right.
Now, someone said I'm using fuzzy math because if I take that 0.035 times 2, I'm now calling that a 1.070 specific gravity. And I fully understand why they're getting that point and why they're saying that, because it's 0.070, not 1.070. Well, here's the thing. I have now added that to water. It's now more dense than water. Water is 1.000. Adding that gravity to a non-dense or a neutral liquid makes the 1.070. Does that help it make a little bit more sense for you?
It does, but that wasn't... That,
I know. I went on a whole different
way
thing.
beyond what I was saying, but I think we've got it that points doesn't mean a number beyond the point. It's just any of those numbers is a point.
It's thousandths of a gravity.
Yeah, so there you go.
Let's go with that.
Number 4 is after primary reading or
Post-fermentation.
post-fermentation reading. The second reading.
Okay, so the second reading is, we generally do that after a few weeks, okay? Once we start seeing the airlock really slow down. One thing that's very, 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 very important is your airlock bubbling activity is really not something to worry about, okay? We get people all the time like, oh, I counted 12 bubbles in this. Don't count bubbles. That doesn't really help you at all. It's not a good idea. All the airlock activity does is gives you an indication that something has occurred or is happening. And in all honesty, even stilled water, just regular water with an airlock on it in temperature changes of a few degrees will bubble. So don't go by bubbles as an indication of fermentation. It just means something changed. It means pressure changed is all it means. So it could mean your brew is off-gassing. It could mean your brew is producing gas, which means fermentation. So that's the first thing I want to get at for that. But what we do, back to number 4, is after we see the airlock activity slow down to like almost nothing. I mean, when it just, okay, I'm not seeing any airlock activity. It's reasonable to assume that fermentation is nearing completion. I said that very, very carefully because it's reasonable to assume fermentation is nearing completion, okay? Doesn't mean it's done. I have seen many people that, well, my airlock stopped, so I bottled it, and it blew up 2 days later. Well, you didn't actually check. You don't actually know. The second reading is far, far, far more important than the first reading. The first reading really just gives you an idea. If you know you didn't overdo it with the sugars.
The first reading is your baseline. The second reading is, okay, I might be done. Where am I at? How much have I progressed through the fermentation process? Am I close to my alcohol tolerance of my yeast? Where am I at?
Yeah.
But that's not the final reading.
Right. We take that reading there. And depending on where it is, we actually have a whole video on this. If it's really close to neutral, 1.000, then it's nearing completion. If it's higher, like 1.030, 1.040, and it's not supposed to be, it probably stalled, okay? But if it's at like 1.002, don't freak out. Don't think it's stalled. We get that a lot too, where people say, oh, my brew is at 1.002, it's stalled. What should I do to get it going again?
You should do absolutely nothing, but wait
probably fine.
a week and then take another reading.
Yes, that is
It's
probably...
that second reading that's probably even more important
Yeah,
than
this is point number 5, the verification reading. That's a good name for it, the verification reading. What that is we take that first reading when it looks like it might be stopping or slowing down, and then we wait a week and take another reading. If that's within like 2 points, then you're reasonably sure it's done, especially if it's a really close to your expected finish gravity, which for most of our brews in the last year or so is like 1.000 or below. We're looking for a dry finish. Why do we do a dry finish?
Because it's so much easier to get the flavor profile and sweetness level reliably if you let it go completely dry and then you back sweeten to your preference.
In addition to that, because we are a BrewTube channel, I don't even really like to say BrewTube, but because we're a YouTube channel and we're teaching people how to do it, we want you to be able to reproduce this at home. So it's inconsistent to hope that it goes over the alcohol tolerance and stops because, yeast can't read. Your yeast don't know our yeast either. They're different communities altogether. They have no contact, so they don't know when they're supposed to stop. And yours don't know that ours stopped at this number. So yours could go further, yours could stop sooner. So vastly different brews can be made using that technique. Now, if it was up to me brewing for myself, I would probably just try to go past the yeast tolerance and go for that. But for teaching, it's much better to go to a specific number and then pasteurize and back sweeten if necessary.
If you watch our older videos, you will notice that we did do that. We did try to surpass the yeast tolerance, alcohol tolerance, so that way we'd end up with a sweeter product.
Without having to pasteurize.
Without having to pasteurize. But we have noticed that since we've stopped that and kept our fermentable sugars to a lower range, knowing that we want it to go dry, we've had less stalls and haven't stressed our yeast as much. So that's another aspect to think about.
Yeah, brews are tasting really good younger because the yeast aren't being stressed. I mean, hey, everybody learns along the way, right? And it's much easier to get to a certain point, and we have more control over what it tastes like, how much sweetness there is at the end.
So that verification reading was number 5. I didn't do my normal little announcement thing. I just jumped right in there.
I said it.
Oh, so number 6.
Wait. Before we get to that, the other thing that the verification reading does, in conjunction with the primary reading, the original gravity reading, is you can then calculate your alcohol by volume, which, keep in mind, anytime we do an alcohol by volume, it's always an approximation. And even commercial winemakers only need to be within 2% either way. I think it's 2%, don't quote me, but it's like 1 to 2%.
It was a shockingly high number that we thought they would have to be really strict on it, and they're not.
So if you say 13% on your brew, that means legally it could be anywhere from 11 to 15%, and you're still considered fine. That's the legal definition. So when I see people go like, well, mine came out to 9.4567%, you can't be that precise. It's just not. You're not that accurate. You're only using 2 digits on the hydrometer to begin with, so you're not going to be able to do triple digits and 4 digits of precision. It just doesn't work. I generally go with half and full points of percentage, meaning like 12 and a half, 13, 13 and a half. I don't really worry about 0.2, 0.3. It doesn't really matter. Most people can't tell the difference anyway between more than, less than a point or 2 of alcohol percentage, so I don't really worry about it. It's just not that big of a deal to me.
All right. So
what's next? We're at number 6.
We're at number 6, right. Number 6. And that's secondary or conditioning. We call it both things.
Yeah, well, see, they're different things though. See, secondary fermentation is when you're expecting it to ferment again. Like it would be, say you did a step feed mead and it stopped too short, or you did a mead and it stopped too short. You wanted a little bit more alcohol in it, or you're trying to step feed past the tolerance level. So you've already racked it. Now you're in secondary fermentation. If you didn't rack it yet, technically to me, you're still in primary fermentation. Yeah. That's kind of the main differentiation there is once you've racked it, now you've moved on to secondary fermentation.
And that's one thing that we didn't put in the process is the racking process, which is an important process.
Racking would happen, well, racking would be 5.5.
5.5 is racking.
Racking is when you move it from one vessel to another. Usually the intent is to get it off of the lees, to get out any solids that might be in there. Someone said the other day that they don't believe that racking helps a brew to clear. I disagree with them, but I understand their point. Simply removing the lees does not do anything to make a brew clear. Let me just be clear on that. But what it actually does do is by keeping those lees out of the brew, it's less chance that when you pick that up, you disturb those lees and get them all misty in the brew again. Some lees cakes don't pack well and you'll get misties and all that. Yeah. And it keeps a cleaner brew. I'm not one to rack 50 times. I know some winemakers do that. They just keep racking and keep racking. I don't believe that leaving something on the lees, especially a mead, for extended periods of time is a problem. Now, extended periods of time doesn't mean days. It means like months, okay? I know people like Adam, one of our mods, he leaves his stuff for 8, 9, 10 months. never a problem. The worst thing that can happen is you might start to get some slight off flavors. Now, if you're making a beer or a cider, something low ABV, yeah, there I can see getting it off the lees within a reasonable amount of time, a few weeks, is probably appropriate. For beers, it might even be more. I'm not a huge beer guy, so don't quote me on that, but I know people with beer tend to be a little bit more particular about that than with wines and meads. So that's racking.
That was our 5.5.
Yeah, that was 5.5.
So we're jumping back
So we're jumping back to 6 now.
because we're chaotic that way.
Yeah, I mean, hey, you know, we had a small list, okay? Filling in the blanks as we go. Now, the second part to secondary is conditioning, and that's kind of a term that we came up with because we were trying to come up with a way to say secondary fermentation without saying fermentation because it seemed kind of inaccurate in many cases. For most of what we do, we make the brew in primary fermentation, we wait till all the readings are done, we wait till fermentation's complete, we rack it into another vessel, and then we put it into what we call conditioning phase. Now, conditioning phase can last days, weeks,
Years?
months. You don't really go years, but months.
Well, yeah, it
at
depends
most.
on what process you're using because
Right.
conditioning phase is to let your brew clear
Mm-hmm.
and to add any flavor adjuncts to it that you felt like it needed. There are some flavors that it's better to wait to the conditioning phase to introduce to your brew because they may interfere with the fermentation process.
Yep, there are some fruits that are too acidic and they can interfere with fermentation. There are spices, there are spices that are antibiotic that can interfere with fermentation. And also for control, because fermentation takes as long as fermentation takes. So if you put something into primary fermentation that only needs 3 days, but your fermentation is going to take a month, you might be disturbing the yeast colony if you try to rack and get that thing out that you added in. So it's kind of one of those things. If it's something that you want very precise control, for instance, vanilla beans, those can overpower, like I swear you could test it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon today, and it's not enough. At 4:30 p.m. today, it's too much. So sometimes you just have to find that happy medium. If you put that into primary, you really don't have that control because tasting a primary fermentation, you don't really know what it's going to end up like. That's the other advantage of doing some additives in conditioning phase. You know what it tastes like. You have a baseline of flavor. It's young, but you have a baseline of flavor. So you can add those adjuncts at that point and taste along the way a more or less finished product to see when you have enough of those things.
Now, the reason why I jumped the gun and pushed it to years in conditioning is that I consider oaking to be part of the conditioning process.
Yes.
That honestly could be a separate thing, but that's why I said years. Because if you had the ability, you had the space to age a wine in a traditional large oak barrel.
Can I talk about the barrel thing?
You certainly can.
Sorry, didn't mean to. But
That's
if you had the ability to do it in a barrel, what?
That would be conditioning and that would be years.
Oh, okay. Now, we don't do that. And there's a very good reason. Even those small 1-gallon barrels, okay, they're kind of fun for a marketing thing, but they're kind of gimmicky, okay? They don't really simulate what happens with wine and other things that get oak aged, okay? Let me explain. We tend to just use like the chunks of wood and we put it in there and it leaks out some of the tannins, some of the compounds, some of the flavors, and it gets into the brew. It's kind of oaking light, okay? True oak aging happens in very large casks, okay, like 50 gallons and up. Some of them are even larger than that. And they are generally left to the elements, meaning in a warehouse where it gets cold and it gets hot. So what happens is, as those temperatures change, the liquid flows into the wood and out of the wood, and into the wood and out of the wood. And over the seasons, it takes different things with it. Some of it evaporates as well. They call that the angel's share in whiskey. And when that happens, it becomes a much richer, more complex product. Now, we can simulate that only if you have that much to do that you can leave it over time. Because if you were to put just a little bit into a 1-gallon barrel and try to do that, it is going to have such a high surface to mass ratio that it's going to over extract so fast it's going to ruin your brew before you really get the full effect of 2, 3, 5, 20 years of aging. So that's my take on the barrel thing. I like the concept, but it seems more gimmicky to me. Also, the smaller ones, somebody's going to tell me that they've done it for 1,000,000 years and it never leaked, but the smaller ones, I hear about them leaking all the time. Maybe it's just the cheap ones. I don't know. I know there's very expensive ones out there. Does that mean we'll never do it? No, I might do it sometime just for fun.
All right. So now what is left? Bottling. Now that you have this beautiful brew that you've created from beginning to the end, it's time to bottle it.
Right. Bottling simply just means putting it into smaller containers so you can store it more easily. Is it a necessary step? No, not really. I mean, technically, you can just take a primary fermentation and chug it back if you really want to. I don't recommend it. You could also just, put your thumb through or your finger through the jug and in conditioning phase and drink back that way. Again, not really recommended. Why not make it as clean as possible, put it into smaller serving sizes, and be able to store it? Because here's the other advantage to bottling. If you put it into a smaller size, if you don't finish it that day, only that much of it is left. Like, let's say you drink half a bottle. You can store that bottle in the fridge, drink it over the next day or two, it's fine. But if you have a whole gallon, you really need to consume that fairly quickly if you're not if you're not going to store it in the fridge or whatever. Even in the fridge, it's still, I don't think that's a great idea.
And the reason being is that that surface area is going to allow for oxygenation to occur, which may...
Oxygenation, yes. Oxygenation.
Words.
She's making up words here.
Things.
That's awesome.
The oxygen getting in there and messing up your brew, making it taste junky.
Yeah, that's basically the gist. Usually once you're past the 10 to 15% range, in that range, vinegar isn't really so much of a problem. It's more off flavors caused by added oxygen to the brew that are really the worry there. But
now there are some times when oxygenation,
look at that, see?
is required, and that's when you're going for sherry notes.
There's a few different brews that go for that kind of thing. We really haven't gotten into that, but yeah, there are a few. Now, when it comes to bottling, you can bottle in pretty much almost any bottle you want. If your brew is fully degassed and not carbonated, yes, you can bottle in mason jars if you really want to. I don't think it's a great idea, but you can, as long as it's degassed and is totally finished and is not carbonated, because they are made to hold pressure pushing this way, not this way. So like against the jar, they're very strong. From the inside out, they're not as strong. Remember that. That's the way they're designed. They're designed for pressure canning where pressures go this way, not the other way. If you're going to carbonate, you want to use a bottle that you know can hold carbonation or has held carbonation before. Used beer bottles are wonderful for that. We get the ones from Aldi that have the free lemonade in them. Those are probably the best bottles you can get. If you go on eBay and try to find those bottles, there's a name on them. They're like $30 to $40 each.
Yeah.
We get them for $2 a piece with free lemonade.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are amazing. We've been using them for years. They're just wonderful, wonderful bottles. Just the best thing ever. We've tried to find replacements on Amazon in homebrew shops, and we just can't seem to find as high a quality. We found a few that are nice bottles, but they're not quite as high a quality. Screw caps versus flip tops, really, to me, almost no difference. The difference is most of our screw cap bottles are not for carbonation. So if it's a stilled brew, we use those. If it's a carbonated brew, we use the other ones.
You can cork your brews if you wish. It's totally fine. The reason why we don't tend to cork ours is that we're looking to reuse our bottles over and over again. And the corks really work best if you get fresh corks each time.
If we were going to make really nice bottles to give away, that's the way I would do it. I would cork them. I would do the wax drip thing or foil wrap or something. We'd make fancy labels. You notice we use masking tape for labels. Why? Because that bottle's going to get reused with something else in a couple of months. We don't stand on fanfare much around here because there's just no reason to for us. Now, if we really get into it, we have made fancy labels before. We have made really nice looking bottles. We have given some away. Unfortunately, we don't really have a lot of friends that like mead and wine and things like that, so we don't really have anybody to give them away to. We have your dad and your brother sometimes drink some, but they just want to drink some. They don't want a whole bottle, so they don't give away the bottle.
There's also legal restrictions in shipping alcohol, so we can't
Absolutely.
do that either.
Yep.
So,
but if we could ship it, our VIPs would be, oh my God, we'd be sending them mead all the time because we have more than we can possibly drink.
Yeah.
So that is the gist for start to finish, how to make a brew without actually teaching you how to make a brew.
What we were intending to do here is to give precise explanations about what each step of the process of brewing was. So hopefully we conveyed that. We know we just talk like crazy, but that's what we do.
Yeah, it's just us. You get used to it after a while. If you have questions about any of these things that we talked about, please feel free to ask in the comments below. One or the two of us will get to your questions. Stuff like this to us is super important. This is basic understanding, and this came about simply because we get these questions all the time, so we know that a lot of people don't understand. And you know what? It is totally okay. We know that every single time someone watches a video, it might be the first brewing video they've ever watched. So we try really hard to make it as simple as possible. Sometimes we repeat ourselves, like I'm doing right now, but we try to make it easy for everybody of all levels. And that, to me, is part of the joy of homebrewing. It's just one of those fun things.
But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching.
And have a great day.
Bye-bye.